Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Hounter64, and I have had a question for a while. Basically, everyone wants to get more gear all the time. We see something online, looks nice and pretty. You see it on Amazon, you see it on Sweetwater, you see it on Musician's Friend, wherever you shop at, and you say, I need this gear. But you never once think, is this worth me investing my money into? So, what I have kind of cooked up in my brain a little bit is a test to see if it's better to invest, and this is for guitar players, I can expand this later, but it's better to invest in an amp or a guitar. Basically, if you're starting out, a big question is, do I invest in getting a really good amp or do I invest in getting a really good guitar? Because not a lot of people can afford both. So I decided, why not make a test to see which one would be more beneficial. For this test, the way it's going to break down is I have two amps and I have two different guitars. The two guitars are basically the cheapest guitar that I have and the most expensive guitar that I have. As for amp choices, my amps are a little practice amp that I have, still formidable power-wise, and then a half stack that I have. So let's get more into the gear. On the cheap end, we have a guitar that I got. It's actually the very first guitar that I ever got. My mom bought it for me at a pawn shop. I have no idea what brand it is. It looks like it could be an Ibanez. I'm not entirely sure because there's no logo, there's no way to identify. I've tried looking at the serial number. And the cheap amp is a Line 6 Spider 4, and I use it as a practice amp. It's convenient, it goes with me if I need to go somewhere, but I would never record with it. On the expensive end, the expensive guitar that we have is actually an Ibanez S6 UC guitar that I did customize a bit. It's the most expensive guitar that I have in my arsenal. Sorry, I don't have a John Petrucci Music Man. For amps, I actually have a Marshall JVM 410H going into a 1960s vintage amp. If you were to break down this test, it's kind of like a grid. You have your expensive amp going into, or you have your expensive guitar going into your expensive amp, expensive guitar going into cheap amp, likewise cheap guitar into expensive amp, and cheap guitar into expensive amp. I feel like I said that twice. Now, to make this test completely biased, I actually used an SM57, as you can see right here, just one of these guys right here. They're fairly common. Almost any recording nowadays probably has some use of a 57 in it, whether it be guitar, bass, vocals, who knows. You can actually pick up a 57 yourself for, like, I think last I saw was $90 on Sweetwater. It's not too expensive, but they're great quality mics. And I have it running into my interface, and the only processing I did to keep the test biased is an EQ on the actual tracks. So if you look here in the project, actually, if I were to open this instance of EQ, you have the EQ basically filtering out your low end, filtering out your high end, and then a little bit of notches in between just to get stuff like flub, a lot of that 4K hiss that's really harsh in the ears. I don't generally like having that in there, but because we're biased, like I said, we'll go here to the cheap guitar. The EQs are actually identical. So I copy the EQs over, they're on every track, they do not differ in any way. The only thing is on my mix bus, I have this compressor here, and that's just because I have programmed drums coming in with just kind of weak guitars. They're not doubled, they're not beefed up or anything, it's just straight guitar. We're only doing this for testing sake. Now, the song that I used is actually off of my band's recent album. It's called Sound Intentions. I just like it. It's a fun riff to play, but we do have 3 examples. Each example is a different category to test the guitar, test the amp, see how the difference is. And I also have the drums as a MIDI file. It's just Superior Drummer here. So as you can hear, yep, just Superior Drummer, basic Superior Drummer. And what we are doing with that is it has the drum part for each of the examples. So the intro riff, all right. Example number 2 is just a chuggy riff. And then example 3 is kind of a beat down shrift, but we're only really caring about the last part, which I'll explain once we get there in the video, but it's just more. And then the last part. Oh. So there you go. So without further ado, I've dragged on this intro way too long. Let's actually get into the test. Moving on to example 2, this is mainly just palm mutings, so let's get into it. Example 2, sample 1. Example 2, sample 2. Sample 2, sample 3. Example 2, sample 4. All right, and then for the final test, this is where we are just going to do singular lead lines, just basically showing articulation overall. Let's begin with example 3, sample 1. Example 3, sample 2. Example 3, sample 3. Example 3, sample 4. Alright, let's go over the results. I did not change the order of which I played them, so for each example, the samples were still in the same order. I didn't switch it around, like say, sample 1 would have been the expensive guitar and cheap amp, and then for example 2, sample 1 was the cheap guitar, cheap amp. Like, they were the same constantly throughout. So for the first one, the first sample was actually the expensive guitar and the cheap amp. So if you want to listen to that again, it's just this one. So the expensive guitar being the Ibanez S6 UC Custom going into the Spider Line 6 IV. Sample 2 was actually the cheap guitar going into the cheap amp, which would be the nameless guitar going into the Spider Line 6 as well. If you want to listen to that, this is how it sounded. For the third sample, it was actually the Ibanez S6 UC Custom going into the Marshall JVM 410H, and that sounded like this. And then the final sample was the cheap guitar, which is the nameless guitar going into the Marshall JVM 410H. So that is how they all went in. Let me know if this test did help you out. Now, as my opinion, if I'm actually kind of conscientious about looking at the waveforms, mainly in the palm muting section. If you look here in the palm muting section, you can distinctly tell, especially on the Marshall amp, the dynamics. There's a huge dynamic push as compared to the Spiderline 6. It seems as if the Spiderline 6 is overcompensating on compression, which does happen. Compression is naturally part of distortion on guitar. However, it seems like the Line 6 is over-compressing, and the file looks more like if you were to limit a file, which is just like a huge kind of like sausage, if that makes sense. Whereas, at least with the Marshall, even on the cheap amp or the expensive amp, so you can't say it's the pickups, it still has that dynamics, especially on the palm mutes. You can definitely see where it's coming in and then where the chords come in. A big difference I also noticed, at least between the guitars, is articulation on the chords. Now, of course, that is a big part, the build of the guitar and as well as the pickups, and that can change a number of things. But I also feel like with the type of amp, the Marshall had more, it kind of felt like it had more of a scooped sound, and that's probably because I actually had it on OD channel 1. And it's supposed to emulate, I believe, a JCM 800 with a more scoop sound. So I normally use that channel for rhythms. If I were to use channel 2 on it, it would be more of a lead channel. I believe it replicates the JCM 900 with a more round tone. But for both amps, the settings are peaked right up at 6. So low, mid, high, all at 6. So there is no difference in amp settings. This is purely just a test to see hardware versus hardware. So especially looking here at the palm muting section, I can definitely tell, like, with the dynamics, you can even hear the chords ringing out better. This is the Ibanez S6UC going into the Marshall, by the way. Like, it feels really even. Like, even though the palm mutes are still climbing above, it still feels like it's being brought down. It could be in part to the equalization that I have, and that's just the waveform coming in. However, I can even take that off. And most of that low end you're getting is very sub resonant. A lot of stuff you'd get in a sub coming out, not something you get, like, say, in a phone, or you may get some of that in your car speaker, but it's definitely not going to come through nearly as much as you would think it would. Whereas if I were to take the expensive guitar into the Line 6, even on the palm mutes, it just doesn't sound as dynamically pleasing. Like, it doesn't have the percussiveness. You see what I mean? And that's even with the EQ on. With the EQ off, it sounds like this. It's almost hard to even tell what I'm playing, really. But the conclusions I would have from this test is it boils down a lot more than just sound, and I know that's a total cop-out answer. However, say you have a guitar that is more expensive. It may sound nicer, but at the oh my god. So you may have a guitar that sounds nicer, but at the end of the day, what really matters is how the guitar plays and how it feels in your hand. Because if you as a player are not comfortable, it gives a bad performance. Now, sound can be moved around, utilized, especially with the type of sound tools we have today. They are very powerful. However, at the end of the day, you can never fix a performance. So keep in mind that your performance is the #1 thing you want to keep track of. If I were to make a decision, I would say, honestly, if you have a guitar you're comfortable with now and it is cheap, don't even worry about it. If you can invest in a really good amp, that will make a huge difference in your sound. Not only will it help it sonically, as you can see from the test, it also will help when you play like live shows, such as projection. Like, having more wattage means more volume. The ability to control its dynamics, keeps certain frequencies in tune the louder it goes. That's another big thing. Because relatively speaking, these amps, when I recorded them, were the same volume, but you can already tell the difference sonically between them, such as the Marshall cranked versus the Line 6 cranked. Like, you can tell like which amp is trying to overcompensate to make it feel fuller. Overall, let me know if you guys did enjoy this test. I think it actually answered a lot of questions for me as well. I can go more in depth on the gear and more in depth on the actual recording. If you guys want, just leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this kind of video, then leave a like, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. That's a wrap, boy.